This is Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, and today we're going to be discussing the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a very interesting system that we have in the body. In the last chapter we talked about the nervous system, and when we think about control, movement, controlling our body, getting information from outside our senses, we think of the nervous system, and that's a major control system in our body. But the endocrine system has a very important controlling role as well. So this is kind of like the second controller, the sister system to the nervous system in controlling our body. There are some differences here. And some of them are, first of all, that the nervous system, as you know, is basically an electrical system. So as we looked at in the last chapter, these ions are helping send electrical impulses throughout our body. The endocrine system, on the other hand, works through molecules called hormones, and we'll look at the different types of hormones. But they can be proteins, they can be steroids, and these molecules travel throughout our body to signal cells to carry out certain processes. One of the results of this is that the endocrine system is a much slower acting system than the nervous system. So the nervous system is basically instantaneous. The minute you think to move your arm, you're already moving your arm. So these electrical systems move very, very fast. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is not as fast acting. A lot of times what's going to happen is the hormones are going to be released into the blood system, and they're going to circulate around the body. So it's not, another thing about this system is it's not as direct. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that it isn't specific, because the hormones in our body are able to target very specific organs and do very specific things, but in order to get there, they take a more generalized pathway. So as the blood's flowing all around the body, these hormones are traveling, and only when they come in contact with those cells that they're trying to signal will that signaling be carried out. The nervous system, on the other hand, is very specific, very direct in its pathway. So those neurons leave the brain, leave the CNS, and go directly to the muscles or the organs that are wanting to be stimulated. And the other thing is that the speed in which these systems, the length of time that these systems continue acting. So the nervous system happens very quickly, and it also stops very quickly. So that impulse is sent, that electrical impulse is sent, and then that impulse stops. Unless you keep on sending impulses, that action, that muscle movement, is going to end very quickly. The hormones, on the other hand, they are much more long-lasting. As they're flowing through the blood, they're stimulating these cells, they last much longer. So those are three major differences between these two systems. Another somewhat difference is what these systems are targeting. Hormones in general are going to be controlling some major processes that are listed here in this slide. So for example, the endocrine system is obviously not going to be dealing with muscle movement, muscle contraction, things like that. That's all the nervous system control. However, it will be dealing with things like reproduction. So we have our steroid hormones that are dealing with reproduction, growth hormones, and development, thyroid, metabolic type hormones, body defenses as well. Hormones will trigger these defenses to be carried out. Homeostasis, and this is maintaining the conditions in our body, as we've talked about, in order to be compatible with life. And these are things such as ion concentration, electrolyte concentration in our body, in our blood, the water balance in our body, etc. So there's this homeostasis. The endocrine system is constantly helping keep our body in this balanced state. And then also, as I already mentioned, the metabolism. So these are some of the things that the endocrine system deals with. Let's talk now a little bit about how hormones are classified. They're classified depending on what type of organic molecule that they are derived from. So in one of our early chapters, we talked about organic molecules, and we talked about proteins, which is a type of organic molecule. We also talked about lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acid. Hormones are going to fall into two main categories. They're either going to be proteins or amino acid base. So remember that the building block of proteins are amino acids, and so some hormones are made from amino acids, and they can be full proteins, large complex structures. They could be just peptides, which are smaller structures, a few amino acids long, or they can even be amines, which are just a single amino acid sequence long. So all of these fit under this large category called amino acid based hormones. And then we have steroid hormones. Steroids come from cholesterol. Steroid hormones, so you're familiar with many of them, I'm sure, such as estrogen and testosterone. Those are steroid hormones. And we'll be talking about some others in this lecture as well. Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. Remember, cholesterol is a lipid, and that's the type of organic molecule that it fits under. And cholesterol has a number of functions in our body, but one of its main functions is to be the precursor to these steroid hormones that are very important in our body. So those are two types, amino acid based and steroid based hormones. There's also something called prostaglandins as well, and these are lipid hormones, and they are involved in communication between cells, and they make up a third category. But the two main categories we're going to talk about in this lecture are number one, amino acid based, and number two, the steroid based hormone. Let's go back to this idea again of hormones just flowing around in the blood. So again, hormones are secreted. There's certain cells that secrete hormones. We call those the endocrine organs. We'll look at the different endocrine organs and where they're located in the body. These are the cells that produce the hormones and secrete them out into the out into the fluids of the body. So if these hormones are just flowing around in the body, how do the cells know whether they're how does it know which cells it's trying to signal, which cells need to be targeted as it's flowing around? And this comes down to receptors on the cells. So hormones, even though they are generally flowing around the body, they are very specific, not can be, but they are very specific to the target cells that they are going to be signaling. And the way they do this is with receptors on the cell. So as these hormones are being secreted from some sort of endocrine organ, let's say this is insulin. Insulin's being secreted out into the blood. It's going to flow around the blood, but it's only going to target those cells that have little protein receptors or other types of receptors that allow that hormone to bind. And those are the target cells. Other cells that do not have those receptors, that hormone is not going to be able to signal that cell. And so even though the endocrine system is very generalized in its movement around the body, the cells that it's going to target are very specific. When these cells are signaled, it can cause a number of different changes to happen. One thing that can happen is it can change the permeability of that plasma membrane, the permeability of the cell. So going back to this idea of insulin, what insulin does, and we'll talk about this more in this lecture, insulin triggers the uptake of glucose by cells. And so when insulin binds that cell, it allows that cell to start bringing in glucose. Glucose can't get through the plasma membrane by itself, and it needs a signal in order to get inside the cell. And the cells need that glucose, and so this hormone signals them to do that. There's some cells that regulate other molecules or regulate pathways inside the cell. Some activate enzymes, an enzymatic pathway in the cell. And the same thing, so you're going to hit this receptor, and when that receptor is triggered, that's going to start a pathway inside the cell. There are hormones that will trigger cells to start reproducing, go through mitosis. For example, growth hormone. So when growth hormone targets a cell, when it signals a cell, that cell is going to start actively reproducing. And so all of these actions are triggered by the reception of these hormones on the cell. Another interesting thing about hormones is how they act on the cells. Some hormones are able to enter the cells, and we call that, and they can be involved in what we call direct gene activation. They're able to move through the plasma membrane unassisted, go into the cell, and directly activate genes inside the nuclei of cells. Other hormones can't get through the plasma membrane, so all they can do is attach to receptors on the outside of a cell. And in that case, we call this a second messenger system because it's going to activate a pathway inside the cell. So even though the hormone doesn't enter the cell, it's kind of turns on the switch that allows a process to begin inside the cell and carry out some sort of action inside the cell. The hormones that can go into a cell and have direct gene activation versus those can only attach to the outside of the cell. This is going to come down to what type of hormone they are, the hormone structure that is involved. So the hormones that can directly move into a cell, these are going to be steroid hormones. And let's remember back here and connect this to what we learned about lipids before. So remember, we have a plasma membrane. Our cells have a phospholipid bilayer, and I'll just draw it as the two lines here. This is our cellular plasma membrane here. Okay, and then we have our outside of the cell, and we have the inside of the cell. And remember, this membrane has a hydrophobic inside and the phosphate heads, the outer layer and the inner layer here, are hydrophilic. And so this determines which type of molecules are going to be able to come in and out. Because of the hydrophobic inside, any molecule that is lipid soluble is able to move right through the membrane. So steroids, even though there's this plasma membrane here, they can diffuse straight through the plasma membrane inside the body. The cells can't really keep them out. So steroid hormones can, this is true for when you think about medicine purposes as well. So if you're giving someone some sort of steroid treatment, steroid hormone, those hormones can diffuse right into the body through membranes in the body, and so they can go directly to work. And that can be good. It can also be a little bit dangerous. You have to be careful with these steroids because they can be absorbed right in. The second messenger system hormones are going to be your amino acid based hormones. So these amino acids, they can't diffuse through like the steroids, especially the proteins. So large protein hormones, peptide hormones, they're going to be too large. Some amino acids can be small enough to go through the plasma membrane, but in general, these large amino acid based hormones, they're going to be too large to go through the membrane. So they get stopped right here. And so we have to have these receptors, these protein receptors, that actually span the width of the membrane here. And so these amino acid hormones, we'll draw it in green here, they can attach to this messenger, to this receptor here, and then that will then stimulate a pathway inside the cell. So let's look at how this happens. I have a few slides here that show this step by step. So in this slide here, we have our steroid hormone coming up to the plasma membrane. Notice how it acts as no barrier. It is able to diffuse straight into the cell. Here's going in. The cytoplasm, remember, that's the part of the cell, the liquid, basically the liquid inside of the cell. Here we have our nucleus. We have these nuclear pores. The nucleus has a double membrane. So you can see the double membrane here, and then we have these pores, the nuclear pores, that allow things to move inside and outside the nucleus. The DNA is inside the nucleus. And remember that the DNA's job is to code for proteins. So that's all the information to make your cell and allow your cell to function. So your DNA codes for these proteins that function in your body that make you who you are. And so these steroid hormones, they're able to come straight into the nucleus. The DNA can't get out of the nucleus, but these hormones can move inside the nucleus. And then as they move in, they're going to bind to some sort of receptor inside the nucleus. So here we have a receptor protein that is binding with our steroid hormone. And now you have this receptor protein has been activated. And so this is going to activate some sort of pathway. It's going to trigger the synthesis of proteins that are needed for some sort of pathway. So this hormone complex can now attach to the DNA, which is going to trigger DNA synthesis. And so what happens is the part of the DNA that codes for a certain protein that we need is going to be activated, and we're going to produce an mRNA strand here. And this mRNA strand is a copy of the DNA. So it came from the DNA. So you have a direct copy of the DNA here. Now that mRNA strand is then going to leave the nucleus, go into the cytoplasm, find some ribosomes, and the ribosome's job is to synthesize proteins. So here's our mRNA, this blue part's the mRNA strand. These red little guys, these are the ribosomes. The ribosomes attached to the mRNA strand, they start reading that mRNA strand. And as they read that mRNA strand, they start to synthesize a protein. Now this protein is needed for some action in the cell. So proteins are the workhorse of our cells. That's basically what does all the work in our cells, our proteins. And so this steroid hormone has come into the cell, bound to the DNA. It's triggered the building of some sort of protein that's going to be used inside the cell. So this is the direct activation method. Now the second messenger system is just a little bit different. So in this case we have our non-steroid hormones. So these would be our amino acid based hormones in general. And they are considered what's called the first messenger. So they're flowing around in the fluids. They come to a cell that they can't get through the plasma membrane, but there are receptor proteins on the outside of the membrane that they can bind to. So here you see this hormone is bound to this receptor protein. That activates this receptor protein, and it's stuck in the plasma membrane. Here we have the cytoplasm inside the cell. And so that first messenger is going to trigger a second messenger system to start. So here we have activated an enzyme inside that is also found in the plasma membrane. And this enzyme is going to activate the second messenger system. So here's our enzyme. Here we've used some ATP, some energy, and we've activated something called CAMP. And CAMP is one of the major second messenger systems inside our cells. If you go on and study cellular biology or molecular biology, you'll see these CAMP pathways a lot in the future. But of course, for this class, we're not going to go into any more detail than just pointing out that CAMP is a second messenger system. And so that's our second messenger. That CAMP molecule is then going to go on to affect some sort of function inside the body. So again, with our hormone here, we're trying to trigger some sort of pathway. And so in this case, we've attached to the outside of the cell, which has signaled this pathway to begin on the inside of the cell. So those are the two main ways in which hormones work. The last thing we want to mention in this part of the lecture is how hormones are stimulated. And so let's look at a few slides here just real quick. In general, hormones are going to be activated by negative feedback systems, which we talked about very early in the course. If you need to go back and review negative feedback systems, I encourage you to do that. We'll see a number of negative feedback systems as we move through these chapters. But in general, remember that a negative feedback is kind of like the thermostat in your house. So you set a certain base temperature, and as that temperature either goes up or goes down, that's going to trigger a process to bring it back, either heating or cooling, to bring it back to that base temperature that you initially had. And so that's how hormones are going to be working. We have some sort of base homeostatic base that we're trying to maintain, and as we fluctuate around, hormones are going to be released in order to get us back into that balance. The first method of stimulus is what's called hormonal stimulus. And what this means is that one of the major ways that we release hormones is by other hormones stimulating the organs of the endocrine glands to release these hormones. And a good example here is the hypothalamus pituitary connection. So we have a hypothalamus inside our head, near our brain. This hypothalamus releases hormones that go down into the pituitary gland. And this pituitary gland will release those hormones when they're needed, when there's some sort of stimulus. So the hypothalamus produces them, they wait inside the anterior pituitary, and then when they're needed, they're released out into the blood. And once they're released into the blood, they are going to trigger the other endocrine organs, such as the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, or the gonads, which in turn will release hormones that will go on to affect other cells. So here we have hormonal stimulus of endocrine organs. Another type of stimulus is what we call humoral stimulus. Humoral refers to blood. And so, or blood or fluid in the body. One of the main fluids, of course, is blood. And so in this case, what's happening is the endocrine organs are monitoring the amount of substance or the amount of some sort of molecule inside the fluids in the blood. And as that changes, then it's going to trigger the release of some sort of hormone. So the example here, we have the parathyroid gland, and one of its jobs is to maintain a certain calcium level inside the blood. And so as the blood is flowing through this organ here, notice it says that you have a low calcium level in the blood. And so these little parathyroid glands here are now stimulated, and they're going to release the parathyroid hormone into the blood, which is going to affect that calcium level. So that's humoral stimulus. And then the last one, I guess here I should mention that the most common type of stimulus is the hormonal. Humoral is next, and the least common type of stimulus is nervous system stimulus. So a neuron going to a certain endocrine organ and stimulating it to release hormones. This does happen, but again, this is the least common type of stimulus of the endocrine glands. An example here is the adrenal gland, and we have our nervous system, our ganglion here, our neurons. They're coming from the CNS. They're traveling into that adrenal gland, and they're triggering the release of hormones out into the blood, which will then go on to affect other cells. Okay, so we have hormonal, humoral, and neural stimulus of these endocrine glands, which will then go to affect the other cells in our body. And finally, let's just look briefly at where the endocrine organs are located. They're scattered throughout the body, so they're not centralized in any certain place, and they don't make up a large portion of the body either. So their bang for their buck is very big. So they're in general small organs that have a very large impact and have a lot of control over our body. We have the pineal gland, which is found in our brain. There's a hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, also found in our brain. And this is what the next lecture. This is what we're going to talk about, is the pituitary glands. We have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands as well in our neck region. We have the thymus gland here. The adrenal glands are sitting right on top of our kidneys, and the pancreas is located very close to our stomach, our digestive system. And then of course we have our gonads, the ovaries in the females, the testes in the males, that are all endocrine glands. So these are our organs of the endocrine system and where they're located. And that's it for this portion of the lecture.